Hi, this is Todd Burns with Homebrew Happy Hour. Today I'm going to show you how to brew an extract beer recipe. My main goal today is to keep this process simple while still giving you enough information to be able to create a great recipe or a great beer. This recipe today is actually a mini mash version. What the difference is between a standard extract and a mini mash version is that we put in these steeping grains, and these steeping grains allow you to actually achieve that particular style of beer better than you would be able to by just using the extracts, which are basically either a LME, liquid malt extract, or a DME, a dry malt extract. Now this particular recipe is called My First Pale Ale, and on the websites, this is on two websites. It's on kegconnection.com and homebrewsupply.com. It actually uses the dry malt extract exclusively. We've gone ahead and calculated it out to use both, so you can kind of see how to use either one when you're brewing. It's not important which one the recipe has. They both work basically the same way. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cover the ingredients and the equipment that you use to homebrew. We'll start with the ingredients. The number one ingredient is, of course, water. There's more water in your beer than anything else, so it's super important. Today, we're going to be using RO, or what they call reverse osmosis water. And this is water that's basically been stripped of all the minerals, everything that's in the water, and purified. And in some beer styles, you want some of those minerals, so you can't add them back in. I'll tell you a secret, though. You can just use tap water in most cases. It works fine in most areas. We have really hard water here, so the RO water works a little better in our situation for today. The second ingredient are grains, and we've covered those some. This is the malted grains, and these are the base grains, which are the extracts, and we talked about liquid malt extract and dry malt extract. A base grain, even if you're doing brewing where you're using all grain and no extracts, you're still going to have a base grain. Most of your recipe is the base grain. And then you have your specialty grains, and the specialty grains are really what gives that beer its flavor. Although they both contribute to it, but the specialty grains are really what you can use to get that flavor that you need for a specific style of beer, which today is My First Pale Ale, and that's available on homebrewsupply.com and kegconnection.com. Both sites have the same recipe, so it makes it easy. And it's a great recipe to brew. I've brewed it before. I really like the recipe, and it's real simple. So let's move on now, and we'll talk about the third ingredient, which would be hops. In today's recipe, as I mentioned, it's a simple recipe. It has Cascade hops. I love Cascade hops. They have a great aroma, they have a great flavor, and although some recipes have a lot of different hops in them, sometimes just a single hop is a great way to do it, I think. Next thing is yeast. Now, yeast is, I would say, an overlooked ingredient in a lot of cases. Yeast definitely adds flavor for the style and adds flavor to the beer. A lot of times a pale ale, in fact, this recipe on the sites, I think, primarily has an American and a British yeast that is kind of a very common neutral yeast. I decided to use citrus today, and the reason for that is I really like that citrusy flavor that you get when you use that in this type of a recipe. I'm using Imperial. We've found that Imperial it has a lot more cells in it, so it starts the fermentation fast and takes it all the way through. I've had really good luck with that, so that's the reason I'm using that particular one today. One other thing on the hops I'm gonna mention is that people talk about hops and how they add a lot of the bitterness to the beer, and some people like the bitterness, some people don't like it so much, but hops add so much more. They add the aroma, they add the taste, the actual taste of the hop besides the bitter. So the flavor that you get from beer is all these different ingredients working together. and they all affect the flavor and they all make that particular style. So to me, it's the most fun thing about brewing is this different combination of ingredients. Okay, now we're going to go through the equipment that you use when you're brewing. So this is kind of your main thing that you use when you're doing an extract recipe, which is a brew kettle. Ours is just a little under 5 gallons. I think it's 18 quarts. It's a perfect size for extract. It works really well because you're not actually going to at any point get to 5 gallons in this kettle. We're going to do that later, and we'll show you that in a few minutes. Another thing you need is the basic things like a spoon, because you got to be able to stir this. We have the fermenter so that when we're done brewing, we'll have something to put the beer in and ferment the beer. We have a secondary fermenter, which also we have a brush for. The secondary fermenter is clear, and this is great because you can see how your beer is clarifying when you put it in here, and then you'll know when to either keg it or bottle it at the end. Last but not least, if you are bottling, you'll need a bucket for the bottling, and then we have a little wand that you use with some tubing that you'll actually push down in the beer bottle and bottle, and we're going to show you that later, but that kind of goes through the basic ingredients. One thing that I left out is the siphon. This auto siphon is really handy because what you can do is start your siphon very easily and then go ahead and go from there from the primary to the secondary. So this is a great tool to have as well. And when it's all said and done, you're either going to use this to cap your bottles, or even better still, you're going to put it in a keg like this and serve it draft. All right, so next we're going to start the brewing process. I'm ready to brew. So first, I have actually pre-measured 2.5 gallons of water. I'm just going to pour that in my brew kettle. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to brew with the full 5 gallons, which makes it a lot easier. So we're just going to turn our stove on here. And we're going to let this heat up to I like to heat this up to about 155 degrees. And then I like to put my steeping grains in for about 20 minutes. This, if you in the future do all grain brewing, this is very similar to how you do all grain brewing. Now I'll tell you this, you're going to see a lot of different directions for doing this online and at different stores and so forth. Just because the directions are different doesn't mean they're wrong. The way that I like to do it, as I said, is I like to bring it to about 155, put my grains in. That's going to drop the temperature a little. Then I bring them back up to 155 or so, 155 to 160, leave them for about 20 minutes. Some other ways that you'll see people say to do it is to put the grains in when they're cold and then bring it up to 160 or 170 degrees and then let them sit for a while. Really, with extract brewing and what you're doing, it's not going to hurt either way. What I like about doing it this way is you are actually getting some fermentable sugars if you do have any kind of a base grain in your mixture of specialty grains, which I know that sounds weird, but it's very common. And we do in this case, so that's the way I like to do it. Okay, we are ready to put the specialty grains in. So this is our mini mash. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these specialty grains in this bag. And then we're going to put them, I'll go ahead and cut again because the bag actually was sealed twice. So kind of the one way you can do this is to kind of wrap the bag around this so you don't spill a whole bunch. and then put it in. So now we have the grains in the bag, and just checked our temperature. I'm going to look at it one more time. And I think I'm going to go ahead and turn this off because we're at about just under a little over 155 that I talked about, but it really doesn't, it's not terribly critical. We're at about 158 because it's going to cool down immediately some when we put these grains in. Now what I like to do is steep them. So basically I'm going up and down in the water like this, kind of get them mixed in, and I like to leave them in here about 20 minutes. And what that does is it gives plenty of time for the sugars and the flavors, everything to get out of the grain and go into your brew pot. So we'll stop for a minute and we'll be back when we're done with this. Okay, my timer's going off, so I've steeped long enough. I'm going to do an extra step here. You do not have to do this, but when you do all grain brewing, when you're done with the mash, you do a sparge, and we're going to do a little mini sparge with this. And the reason for that is to just get, I know there's still sugars in here and flavor in here, and I can't stand to leave it in this bag. So I've heated some water up to right around 160 degrees. You can go as high as 170, so you don't have to wait as long for your boil. And I'm just going to go ahead and pour that on here and get a little bit more out of these grains before we move on. This is going to give us a little bit more boiling, but we've got a big enough pot here. I'm not worried about that. So again, you don't have to do this. I just like to get that last little bit out. Makes me feel better. So now that we've done that, I'm going to hold this up. It's a little hot because I just poured really hot water on it. So give me a minute. Okay, I'm going to hold this up. And I'm going to let that drain for a minute. And then once that's done, we'll start putting our other fermentables in, and we'll bring it to a boil so we can add our hops. Okay, I went ahead and poured myself. I have a Maibach that I brewed. This was actually an all-grain recipe. Turned out really well, nice and clear. And I think it's always a good idea to have a home brew while you're brewing and relax, right? As Charlie would say. Almost ready. Okay, we are at a boil now. So we are ready to add our fermentables. The guy that's filmed this was just giving me a hard time. He said that I called this a Maibach, and he thinks it's supposed to be called a Maybach, but May didn't brew this, I did. It's a Maibach, so what does he know? All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to add half of our fermentables. So we're going to add one of the bags of the DME, the dry malt extract, and we're going to add half the jar of the liquid extract. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times you're just going to have one of these, one or the other, but I wanted to kind of show you how to use both. So the dry is susceptible to steam. It'll kind of start to clump up a little bit if you get a bunch of steam in there. So what I like to do is, well, first and foremost, I like to take it off the burner first, because if you take it off the burner, you'll have a less likelihood of having a boil over. A boil over is where you put your fermentables in, and it'll actually start to boil harder or boil over, and you get a big sticky mess everywhere. So if you take it off the burner, it actually will usually completely avoid that issue. So I'm just going to start stirring as I'm slowly pouring this in. And you can kind of see it clump up a little as I do that, but that stuff will dissolve and go in as long as you keep stirring it. So there we are. So we've put that in, and now I am going to put in the liquid. On the liquid, take the cap off. You're going to have a liner on here you got to peel off, and then you just pour it in. Again, slowly while you're stirring. Stir it real good. And I'm going to pour, about half in here. You don't have to be super particular here. If you don't get exactly half, it will not make a difference. So that's about half. I'm good there. Then I'm going to go ahead and stir this for a while and get it good mixed up. Then I'm going to put it back on the burner. I'm going to bring it back to a boil so we can start adding our hops. But at this point, you want to be careful because, again, it will boil over and it'll come to a boil pretty quickly. So what I like to do is watch it real close and then start to turn this burner down as it gets closer to the boil. So we'll go ahead and bring this back to a boil now. All right, now we are going to do our hop additions. So hop additions are, some people will call it a hop schedule. You decide when you're going to add your hops, and the reason you add at different times are for different reasons. Now, this is a very traditional, very basic hop schedule on this recipe. We're going to have a hop addition at 60 minutes, at 15 minutes, and then at 5 minutes. So the one at 60 minutes, this is where your bittering comes from. So that's going to be 1 ounce of Cascade hops, and that, again, that will give us our bittering. The 15 minutes, we're going to do a 1/2 ounce of Cascade, and that's going to be our flavor. That's where you're going to get more of your hop flavors from. And then the 5 minute is where you're going to get your aroma. The 5 minutes, another 1 ounce of Cascade, but you're going to get very little bittering from that one because you're only boiling it for 5 minutes. You're not really releasing very many oils, but again, you do get that aroma, that really nice aroma. With the pale ale, you really want that, so it's nice. Now, I will mention with recipes, there are other hop additions that we should probably cover, although if you're doing a basic recipe, it's your first recipe, I would try to stay with a recipe that has this type of addition, so it doesn't become overwhelming. There's a Whirlpool hop addition, which is done after your boil while you're doing what they call a whirlpool, although we're not doing a whirlpool, where you, in an all-grain system, you create a whirlpool and it puts all the stuff in the center. But even with an extract, you can do that. You just do it and let it sit in there. And then there's also dry hopping. That's a term that you hear a lot these days in the brewing industry. And all that means is that you're putting those hops in after your fermentation is completed, and no, maybe not 100% completed, but pretty much completed. And then you leave them in for between 5 and 7 days, and that's all going to be aroma. It's nice, but it's for some other styles primarily. So what we're doing here is, this is a very traditional recipe. This is the perfect hop addition. I'm going to tear these open. Again, these are Cascade hops, wonderful aroma. One of my favorites. So now we're going to go ahead and pour these in, and our boil kettle's not very full, but if your boil kettle's real full and you've got a pretty vigorous boil going, you can actually boil over at this point, so just watch it and be careful. Ours is not super vigorous and our pot's not very full, so I know we're not going to have a problem. So now I've poured these in. And these are hop pellets, but you can see they very quickly dissolve and go into a leaf form. So we're just going to stir that for a minute, and then we're going to start our timer for 1 hour, or actually what I like to do is I like to start my timer for when the next hop schedule is. So I'll actually put it in for 45 minutes so that I know when I'm 15 minutes out, I'm getting ready to add my next hop. that it'll go off and it'll remind me of that. Okay, we are about ready. Yep, there we go. So now we have 15 minutes left in our boil, or we're 45 minutes into our boil. And at this point, we have another hop addition. And this is just half an ounce, but get a little flavor, hop flavor in here, because we all like hop flavor, right? And we will be back. Actually, we have another addition, 5 minutes till the end of the boil, but I'm going to set it a little early because we're also going to put some Whirlfloc in here and talk about some other things at that point. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a Wort chiller. We're not going to be using a Wort chiller today. We're going to use an ice bath. This one's probably a little big for this kettle for the type of brewing that we're doing. I use this a lot for all grain, but they make a smaller version that's about half this size. You can actually put this into the pot and let it boil 10 or 15 minutes before the boil's done, and it'll sterilize it. And then if you have a second one that's in an ice bath like we have here, you don't need to worry about sterilizing that. All you have to do is sterilize this. Because remember, the water that's flowing from your water hose or whatever your water source is never touching the beer. The only thing that's touching the beer is the surface of this Wort chiller. Wort chillers work really well, particularly when you get into all grain brewing and you've got a lot more to cool down. But again, in a little bit, we'll show you how to use an ice bath. It's a simpler method and what we use a lot of times when we're doing a mini mash type recipe. Okay, another alarm going off. So this means we have 5 minutes left. We're going to do a couple things here. First, we're going to put in our Whirlfloc. Well, it doesn't really matter, but we can put the hops in as well. We're going to do both of these now. So what I actually like to do is put the hops in first. It's our aroma hops. Put those in, give them a little stir. Got a few hiding down in there. And then we put in the Whirlfloc. Originally, people used what they called Irish moss, which was literally a type of dried moss. And now a lot of people will use Whirlfloc, which does the same thing. It'll bubble and fizz around in there. You want to do it 5 minutes before you end your boil or less, because it loses its ability if you boil it longer than that. So you don't want to do it too soon. And this kind of grabs those proteins and solids and drags them down to the bottom so that your beer clarifies easier. So it's a great, and they're very inexpensive. It's a great thing to do at the end of your boil to make your beer a little clearer in the end. Okay, we have done the Flameout now, so we need to put our additional fermentables in. Again, I'm going to start with the dry malt extract. Pour it in slowly, stir well, get a good mix there. Now this becomes pretty thick because we have not added the additional water we will be adding. Do the same thing with the liquid. And now we have a lot of fermentables in here, and we will be ready to ferment our beer. So next, we're going to put some ice. You're going to probably do this in your kitchen sink, and your kitchen sink's going to be small. This sink is not small, so we got this bin, which is still a little too big, so it's going to be hard to get enough ice in here, but we'll put some more in a moment. This will get us started. Usually in a smaller sink, you can just do this with a bag or two of ice. So you gotta be real careful when you're doing this. Don't want to burn yourself like I did last week. Move it in there. Now, what I normally do is put it in with ice, and then I add a little cold water as well so that you get a little slush in here. And when you get that slush going, it'll really cool this down. You don't need to get it over the level of the wort. Just get it kind of up to the wort and then move it back and forth. You can agitate it a little bit, and we're going to start cooling this wort down. And what we're going to try to do is cool this wort down to the point where we can add in some additional water when we put it into the fermenter. And we want to get that to, it depends on the style of beer, but today we're going to get that to about 70 degrees. And you need to know what the temperature is of the water you're putting in, because you don't want to miss that temperature when you pour the water in. So because we know we had about 2.5 gallons, a little bit more, because remember we added some to the grain to get the last bit of sugar out. We've probably boiled down to about 2.5, even though we added that extra. So we're going to add another 2.5. So what I like to do is take the temperature here, and then take the temperature of the water we're going to add, and then you kind of know when you add that water what the final temperature is going to be. Okay, next we're going to talk about sanitizing, one of my favorite subjects. I'm going to go ahead and fill this area here for the proper amount for 6 gallons and pour that in. And this is a product called SandStep, great sanitizer. I also use this BTF iodophor a lot, another good sanitizer. Neither one of them foam, have any of those issues, and they're effective in some places where some of the other sanitizers aren't, like in hard water and those types of situations. So we have this sanitizer now, and we've got it pretty much mixes itself, but I always like to give it a little stir. You can tell it changes the color just a little bit, and you can tell that it's done well. So I've got my thermometer here, which is good because I'm about to use my thermometer in the wort that is starting to cool down. From this point forward, after you've turned off the boil and you're starting to cool your wort, everything that touches anything has to be sanitized. So I'm going to put this in here and leave it in there for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to start checking my wort temperature and make sure that we're getting down to the temperature we need to ferment. Another thing I like to do when I'm sanitizing, I like to get this bucket all the way full, even maybe overflow it slightly, so that I know that everything is sanitized well. I put enough sanitizer in here to actually do the full size of the bucket. Just read what size your bucket is. And a lot of these are around 7, so I put enough in for 7. Now, you want to sanitize your bubbler. So I put that in there. And we already sanitized the thermometer, of course. I've just been holding it like this, so I haven't touched anything. For the lid, a lot of people are curious how to sanitize the lid. Sometimes you can just pour stuff on it. These buckets are pretty flexible. So what I do is I just push that lid all the way down in there, and I let it pretty much just sit in there while I'm finishing cooling down the wort, and then I'll dump it out right before I get ready to put the wort in this bucket. When I do that, often what I'll do though is I will take a smaller bucket or some other vessel and put a little sanitizer in there, just in case you need a little more to re-sanitize something while you're finishing up. Okay, I am taking a temperature reading here, and what I'm seeing is that we're at about 74. My water is a little bit under 60, so when I mix these two together, we're going to hit right around that 70 range that we're looking for. It may be actually slightly under, which will be fine for the yeast we're using, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Now, I mentioned that you have to sanitize everything before you use it at this point. Remember that this spoon has been in this vessel since it left the boil, so it's already fine, so we don't have to worry about the spoon. Now I'm going to pour this in. Okay, and then next, I'm just going to take this RO water that I've saved, and I'm going to pour it in until we hit around this 5-gallon mark. Now what I might do though, just to be sure, is stop a little short and take a reading to see how much sugar I have in this. So I'm stopping at about, say about 4.5 gallons for right now. Okay, I am going to use an instrument called a refractometer for this next part. You can also, a lot of kits come with a hydrometer, which you will use regardless of whether or not you have one of these. I like these because when you're working on your brew day, you don't have to sterilize it every time. You don't have to put a lot of wort in there to test it. You just need a few drops. And what we're doing here, remember that we didn't fill that all the way. This one actually has a light built into it, an LED light, which is nice. And I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing that I'm over 1.060. I'm at about 1.063 or 1.064. So what that tells me is I got plenty of sugar because we're shooting for 1.054. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up to the 5-gallon mark, and then we'll check it again and see where we are, but we should be right on. Okay, so now I've brought this up to 5 gallons. I'm going to take just a little bit more of this, and I'm going to put it here on my refractometer. Carefully put this back in there. And I'm going to take a reading and see where we are. Yeah, we're right about 1.053 or 54. Right where we want to be according to the recipe. So this should give us what we were looking for as far as the final alcohol by volume or alcohol level. Now, one thing to remember is that you may have a hydrometer. In a hydrometer, what you do is you put this liquid in here, which is the wort, of course, and you fill it up. Then you put the hydrometer in. I always like to give it a little spin to get any bubbles off. And then you want to read the specific gravity, and it'll read the same. Now, I have it in water right now because I didn't want to put the wort in here and waste it. So it's going to, when you have water in here, it's going to read 1.000, which is, that's what a hydrometer reads when it's reading water. So you know it's accurate if it's reading that. I like to use one from Kessler, USA. It's a American-made hydrometer, really good quality, and you can get that on kegconnection.com or homebrewsupply.com. Now that we have everything ready, we're going to start aerating the wort. And the reason you aerate the wort is you want to get some oxygen in there. So what I do is I take this spoon and I start hitting it pretty hard. Not enough to splash all over the floor, except maybe a little. But what you want to do is keep doing this. I like to do it about a minute or so, and you're introducing oxygen. So oxygen is in your beer, in your final beer, is bad because it oxygenates it and gives it kind of a cardboard taste. Oxygen in your wort before you pitch your yeast is very good. The more oxygen, the better. So you want to do that for a while, and then when I'm done doing this, we'll pitch the yeast, and we'll be just about done. Okay, so I have my yeast in here. I had it upside down so that I'm basically making sure that everything's sanitized. I sanitize my knife. I like to give this a really good shake before I pour it in. Again, this is citrus from Imperial. Now, if you purchase this recipe, this may not be actually one of the choices that you have, but you can always just pick no yeast and then go in and buy this individually. It's a personal preference of mine. I like that flavor in this particular beer, but it may not be 100% the traditional one that people would use. So I have got this ready. Now you could tear that, but I sanitized my knife, so I'm just gonna cut it off and get it out of the way with my knife. And remember, I was vigorously doing this for 2 minutes to get that oxygen in. I'm gonna do that a little more, and then I'm gonna pour my yeast in, and I'm gonna get it mixed in real well. Give it a little more oxygen, because it loves oxygen. And now, all we have to do is cap this off, and it should start fermenting pretty quickly. So here we go. I'm going to take my cap. Now my cap's upside down, or my lid is upside down, because I remember I have this all sanitized and nothing has touched this. So I'm going to be careful not to touch it, although I've had my hands in the sanitizer. What I like to do is just grab a little bit of sanitizer in here so that the bubbler bubbles up and down and nothing can come through. It's like a one-way valve. It's got little holes on the top that let the air out. And when that starts bubbling, you know that you're fermenting. So that's always a good thing. So we're done. Pitched our yeast. We're going to put our lid on. We're going to put our bubbler in here. And our brew day is complete. So all we have to do now is wait for it to start fermenting, let it finish fermenting, or almost completely finish fermenting, and then next, in a few days, maybe a week, we'll show you how to put it to the secondary. Okay, next, now that we're all done, the last thing I like to do is my documentation. So I've written the name of the recipe. I like to use these tags that have the little wires on them, but I also use the recipe sheet. This one is from Homebrew Supply, and I like to write down the date, the temperatures that I'm doing. Original gravity is very important to write down. So when we took that original gravity reading, which was about 1.053, you're going to need that when you have your final gravity reading to be able to determine how much alcohol is in here. And what I typically do is I'll do that, write it all in. I actually like to put it on both of these because I put this on my keg when I'm done. And then I just slip this into a Ziploc bag. I put a little hole in it, and I run the wire through here. And then I can put this directly on the beer so it stays with the beer. And if you do good documentation, you'll really appreciate it, because as you brew more and more, you'll know what's happened and why it's happened due to that documentation for the most part. Now, I also write the name of the yeast. I basically write any information. I like to write where I started my fermentation, the temperature, all of this stuff, because again, the more and more you brew, the more that you'll appreciate this information and use this information. So it's a good habit to get started in it right away. So I think we've had a fabulous brew day, and I hope that you'll try to brew a recipe yourself soon.
This program is made possible by the checkbook of Mr. Todd Burns and by contributions to our newly launched Patreon by viewers like you. Visit patreon.com/homebrewhappyhour and join our community. Thank you.